This is Nailing the Apex. I'm Tim Hauraney. Please head on over to Spotify, give us a 5-star rating and a follow. Same goes with Apple Podcasts as well. You can also watch us on YouTube. Joining me today from Singapore, home of this weekend's Singapore Grand Prix, from ESPN F1, reporter Laurence Edmondson. Laurence, thanks so much, man, for taking the time to do this. I know it's pretty late there.
Well, it is late. It is and it isn't. So, yes, it's now 1:30 nearly a.m. for clarity. And that sounds quite late, doesn't it? But because of the it's no longer a unique schedule, because we also do this in Saudi Arabia, but because of the unusual schedule of a race weekend where the race starts at 8 p.m., everything gets moved much later. So people come here, from Europe, and they try and stay more or less on European time. The slight complication this time round, and we've had this before as well, is that Japan is the next race. So you've got to get yourself from a kind of European time zone while staying up at night in Asia, right round to a normal Japanese time zone for a normal race weekend. And that's a challenge. I tried that before and it's a challenge. So yeah, the next few days are going to be tough, but hey, I'm out here reporting on a great sport. So don't feel too sorry.
Still, so okay, it's what is it? Is it 6 hours from the UK to Singapore, the time change, or is it less?
The time change, I think, is 7 or 8. I have a watch that tells me exactly what it is, so I don't have to work it out in my head. But yeah, I think it's 8. Is it?
Okay.
We're 12 hours to where you are.
Yes.
That's what I know. That's the easy bit to do because, again, I was working with my American colleagues at ESPN. I just have to look at my watch and pretend it's no longer morning, it's evening, or vice versa. And there you go, you've got your time.
But then once you go to Japan, so what's the time difference from Singapore? Like, I guess from the UK to Japan, what is that?
Yeah. So I think, having thought about it just now and done a quick conversion in my head, yeah, it's 7 hours to Singapore. Okay. 8 hours to Japan. So we go an hour as well, in the wrong direction for what I feel like right now. So yeah, it all adds up. But, it's interesting talking to Valtteri Bottas. Did a group media session earlier today, and he was saying how he deals with it, and that last night he was up until 5 a.m. Apparently not doing anything exciting, because it sounds outrageous, doesn't it? Oh, you're up to 5 a.m. You must have been out at bars or whatever. But no, he was just up 5 a.m. doing his emails and stuff, went to bed, set his alarm for the afternoon, got up and went to the track. But he said, he'll just try and get to Japan as early as he possibly can after the race, and then just immediately try and change the time zone to something a little bit more Japanese.
That's pretty wild. Like what everyone kind of has to do to adjust to the time changes. Because I know the folks down at Aston Martin, like when they're during the race weekend, so they will essentially be working at the track just before sun breaks, and they'll want to make sure that they're getting back to the hotel so that they don't get the first glimpses of sunlight, which would then ruin off their sleep pattern.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds absolutely spot on. And the other thing you need is a good set of blackout curtains in your room.
Yeah.
The first year I came to Singapore, I was on a slightly more modest budget, shall we say, and I stayed in a room without a window at all. And I got in there for, oh God, this is awful. But it actually turned out to be great because it meant there was no sunrise waking me up each morning. But yeah, there's lots of little tricks teams do, and they have schedules planned out. They have people that really work on this to try and make sure they're eating at the right time. They'll have advice on time to do exercise. They'll use melatonin as a way to try and get sleep. So there's all these little things you can do to try and sort out your body clock and get it as close to where it should be. But ultimately, it's tricky. And then on top of that, for the drivers and I guess the mechanics as well, you're dealing with one of the most physically demanding races of the season, just because of the heat and humidity, which doesn't. I mean, the day is definitely hotter, but it remains hot through the night, and it also remains very humid. So there's a lot that the drivers have to deal with, just before they kind of start performing at the level we know they can.
Yeah, which is wild. Like I was listening to the pre-race weekend post press conference by the FIA that they run on Thursdays. And it was just interesting to hear like some of the drivers, what they have to go through within the race, how much weight they lose. Like some of them saying, losing up to 8 pounds, and then with the drinks. So the drink bottle in the car and how it eventually turns to hot tea. and having to drink that. Some of them having to drink that. I know Lance was saying that the last 20 or 30 laps he's drinking hot tea because, you know, he sweats a lot and needs to replenish the fluids, but a driver like Logan Sargent doesn't even touch it.
Yeah. Well, and this is, and you know, and these things fail as well. So, you know, you can often have a drinks bottle and then it'll fail. I think the largest drinks bottle they can have is 1.5 liters. That's very rare. Most of them are smaller than that, just because of where it's got to fit in around the cockpit. And as you say, look, it's going to get very, very hot. And yeah, so some of them choose not to do it, which is pretty crazy. I think, yeah, I'm a bit worried about Sargent. He was saying that, wasn't he, in the press conference, that he plans to go without a drinks bottle. And I was just thinking, you know, first Singapore Grand Prix, and it's not going to be quite as long a race this year because they've changed the track layout slightly, and that should mean that it gets under that 2-hour time limit that it sometimes runs up to with safety cars. But even so, like, you know, it's tough. And I did an interview with Dr. Luke Bennett, who used to work for Hinsa in Formula One and worked very closely with Mercedes and a number of teams and drivers. And he said, you know, the heat stress, which is your body, the way it dissipates heat, that's one of the big things that you're working against. And everybody's different, but that can really start to impact, along with the dehydration, which is the loss of the weight that you mentioned, up to 8 pounds or so. The two of those things together can really impact concentration, because the optimum, I'm going to have to work in kilos here because that's what I was talking to him in, 1 to 1.5 kilos is about as much as a F1 driver wants to lose in dehydrate, or, you know, kind of sweating it out before their cognitive ability is impaired. So when you're going up to 3.5 or maybe 4 kilos, it's significantly more. So that's why I think we do sometimes see mistakes creep in. And I think it's why at this race, you know, you can't underestimate even a driver kind of cruising around just trying to score a point in 10th place. That is such a hard workout, often more so if you're in a car that's misbehaving. So yeah, it's very impressive, and something to keep in mind for anybody who's watching this weekend, that there's a lot going on behind the scenes to make sure these drivers are in prime condition.
Yeah, and these are, you know, the drivers are getting ready for this race like months in advance. It's not like they started doing heat training 2 weeks ago or just after the Italian Grand Prix. Like, they've been doing stuff like this for quite a few months so they can get their bodies acclimatized to the harsh conditions that they're going to face. And then obviously on top of all that, the strength that goes into hustling an F1 car around a track like Singapore, which is not one of the faster tracks. So, which means there's a lot more work being done in the race car for these guys. Pretty impressive, though, like, nonetheless, of what they have to do, the concentration they have to keep at a track like this, considering all of the harsh elements that are being thrown at them. We had some war of words between Mercedes and Red Bull a bit to start this one off. So following the Italian Grand Prix, where Max Verstappen had set a record 10 straight Grand Prix victories, so Toto Wolff, during his post-race press conference, had been asked about what, you know, Max had done and the stat and the record, and Wolff kind of downplayed Verstappen's achievements, saying, quote, I don't know if he cares about the records. It is not something that would be important for me, those numbers. It is for Wikipedia, and nobody reads that anyway. So keep in mind, you know, Mercedes, you know, they did not have a great Italian Grand Prix, so obviously Toto not extremely happy at the end of that one, but this quote was actually put forth, well, not the entire quote was put forth, but the generalization of the quote was put forth to Max earlier on Thursday, in which he replied with, quote, I'm not disappointed in that, but they had a pretty shit race, so he probably was still pissed off with their performance. He almost sounds like he's an employee of our team sometimes, but luckily not.
Yeah.
Oh, Laurence, where do you go with this, man?
Well, as a journalist, and
you're as a journalist, let me just see.
But you know, this is not bad, because we've got a season where we're going into each race kind of not really able to talk about who's going to win here, because we know that if everything goes smoothly, it probably will be Max. So it is interesting, but I think it says a lot about the dynamic between those two teams, and at times they claim to have patched things up, but it's clear that they still rub up against each other, and it's clear that from a Mercedes point of view, seeing Red Bull go and do what they're doing at the moment, dominate, do what Mercedes never got round to doing, which was win all the races in the season. Red Bull are on target for that. Break consecutive win records as Max Verstappen has done. I think the most Mercedes ever got was 7 with Nico Rosberg, funnily enough, not Lewis Hamilton. And so all of this, I think it got to a point with Toto at the end of a long race weekend where he basically said what he felt, which, again, as a journalist, I don't really have a problem with that. I quite like it when people say what they've really got on their mind. And that's what came out. And then, I think Max's response today was absolutely spot on. I think Max should be very proud of winning 10 races in a row. No one's ever done it before. That's why it's the new record. And it is massively impressive because it requires consistency. Fernando Alonso was actually talking about this at the Dutch Grand Prix after Max had equaled Sebastian Vettel's record of 9. And said, it shouldn't be underestimated. And he felt that it often is underestimated, that when you're in a top car, it is hard to string these kind of runs together. But by the same, I can kind of understand a little bit, because the bit that didn't really get quoted much of Toto's media session was he said, oh, actually, if Red Bull do go and win all the races, I will be impressed by that, because that's something we always wanted to do and didn't manage. So he actually did give a little, maybe slightly reluctant tip of the cap to Red Bull's dominance. But the Verstappen record is an unusual one, because I think it requires a number of things. One, a very dominant car, and we've seen that many times in the sport. But perhaps one thing that we don't always see, which is a teammate who, for whatever reason, is really struggling. And Checo obviously is. Now, that's not to say Max isn't performing at a brilliant level. That's not to say if you threw, I don't know, maybe even 80% of the drivers in there, they would actually be able to beat Max. But I think the margin that Max has over Checo at the moment, it is a part of that record. So I don't know whether Toto was trying to get at that it's a bit different to maybe some of the others. But even so, I mean, I don't really agree with that school of thought. I do think that winning 10 Formula 1 races in a career is a big deal. Doing it in a row is another level.
I think, Jenson Button actually had some interesting comments during, I think it was last week, up at Goodwood. I think there was an event going on up there, and he had talked about how, for most drivers, I don't think they would want to be in the same car as Max Verstappen at this point. And I tend to agree with what Jenson was actually saying there, because, one, I mean, this car is geared a little more towards Max's driving style, but at the same time, he's been very faultless this whole season. He hasn't really made any mistakes, Laurence. He's been very impressive. And he's been put in some difficult situations. It's not like getting to these 10 Grand Prix victories straight through has been an easy ride for him. He has had his moments for sure. And then I think the Dutch Grand Prix was a pretty impressive performance from him, considering the different weather conditions he had to face, and then having to deal with that damp, drying track, and then going back to those conditions again and not knowing the severity of those conditions. Red flag. And you've got Fernando Alonso behind you, who's hungry for a win. Can't make any mistakes there. And so I think how Max has gotten here has been extremely impressive. I think the team, for as long as they've been winning, has been impressive. I mean, that goes all the way back to just after Brazil last season. I think they've won every race ever since. It's been extremely impressive what they're doing. Do you think they can actually, run the table here? Do you think it can? Because I think the only track left on the calendar that I'm thinking of that's going to throw up any surprises, I think it's this one. I think it's Singapore.
Well, Red Bull seem to think exactly the same. Yeah, they've mentioned that a few times, and Max mentioned it again today, that this is a circuit that they think maybe won't suit their car quite as well as some of the others. And there is that random element. The chances of safety cars are high. We saw with Max last year here, the team sent him out basically without enough fuel, and therefore he had to come back into the pits before his final quali lap. And obviously didn't qualify as well as he should have, and then struggled back to 7th place. So, if you do start out of position, it's not a guarantee that you get back to the front. I think one of Max's very impressive wins this year was at Spa, where he had the gearbox penalty, but still came through. But he did that, within a matter of laps, because at Spa you can easily overtake. Definitely not the case here. So, it's always possible at a race weekend. Something can just trip you up along the way. We saw in Saudi Arabia this year, of course, drive shaft issue in qualifying. Max starting from towards the back, managed to get up to second place. Again, massively impressive behind Checo, but didn't quite win that one. So, I think there's a chance that this is the circuit where something trips them up. But by the very nature of Formula 1 cars and unreliability and all the rest of it, it could actually happen anywhere. But also, back to the Red Bull, can they do the whole clean sweep? Absolutely. Like, if nothing goes wrong with those cars, yes. And Max is definitely capable of winning the rest of the races. And I think even Checo, if he was in a position where a race win was all of a sudden on the table again, I feel like we'd maybe see a slightly different Checo as well.
Do you think, do you think for next season anybody can actually catch up to them? Because it's a conversation that's been starting to do the rounds, and then there's been arguments about balance of performance, and should there be a balance of performance within Formula One and for these teams? I mean, the teams obviously don't want it. Imbalance of performance, meaning, for an example, moving around ballast or adding ballast to a winner who is running away with the championship, or because that's what they did in DTM. If you won one of the races, they'd throw some ballast into the car, and in hopes of slowing the team down a bit so everyone else can kind of catch up and play on the same playing field. But when you look at balance of performance, is that something that would interest you? My only thing with it is that, obviously you're taking away, I guess, from the purity of the sport, but at the same time, Formula One has a lot of eyes on it now. They have a massive growing fan base. The sport is really taking off, but I guess the more you get dominance within Formula One, maybe the less you may be getting of those fans. They may start dropping off.
Look, I agree that the dominance by any single team in Formula One is not good for the show. It doesn't make it any more entertaining. But I don't think balance of performance is the answer. I think it's a very risky business, and you think the teams argue now, and you think that they fall out now while one team is dominating. Imagine if you throw success ballast kind of dimension in there, and and again, we have to do is look back to 2021, and a decision was made on the final lap of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix that was very, very questionable, and it did seem like outside interference from the governing body. And so if it was intentional or not. Now, this would be intentional, and to really have a situation where it can operate and continue to be the way it is. I don't think it would suit Formula One. What I think we've seen in previous years is that once we get a better understanding of the regulations, perhaps some of the regulations can be adapted slightly to try and hold one team back. It's not always successful, but we have seen it done in the past, and it's not always that upfront either. It's very rare. It's often done on safety grounds or some other kind of grounds. But we have seen that balancing things out in the past. So I don't know whether that's possible or whether the other thing we've seen in Formula One in the past is that if you do leave a set of regulations and you don't tinker with them too much, you will eventually get convergence. But back to your original question is, can anyone catch a Red Bull? I don't think we're there yet. I think because these regulations are still relatively new, only in the second year, and Red Bull found huge gains from their first season to their second season. Some of that came from shedding weight, but a lot of it came from what they were doing underneath the car and the general aero philosophy, and just finding a very rich vein of form to tap into. I don't think it's going to happen next year. I'd like to think teams will get closer. I think Ferrari and Mercedes especially have really pinpointed where they've gone wrong. And a lot of it is not necessarily the outright performance of the car, because we've had a few qualifying sessions where obviously Ferrari got close or beat them beat Red Bull in Monza, in Azerbaijan, then Lewis in Hungary. So, obviously that's not enough to make a competitive season, but it's in the race where they're really struggling. And a lot of that, I think, is to do with just the consistency of the car through a race. So that it's one thing to fight it on the knife edge for a single lap and somehow, manage to get pole position. But yeah, doing that over a full race isn't possible, because both the Ferrari and the Mercedes have some pretty nasty handling traits. But both those teams believe that they've found ways out of it. And, as we've seen with other teams as well, the likes of Aston Martin, McLaren, to some extent Mercedes this year, a change in direction can all of a sudden yield quite a lot of performance. So my hope is they get closer, but I do believe that, Red Bull aren't, scratching their heads now thinking, how are we going to add development to this car? Because every time they do bring stuff, and, they probably don't bring quite as much as other teams because they're slightly limited. And of course, they'll be looking to next year as well. But when they do bring stuff, it still really works. So it's not like they're lost. They absolutely know what they're aiming at. And they're, like I said, mining this very rich vein of performance at the moment.
Yeah, the only thing I look at is, like you'd mentioned with McLaren, this season, and then also with Aston Martin last season, is the turn in performance. I mean, you could also kind of argue the same about Mercedes as well, because once they had their, big upgrade added to the car in Monaco, it's been a lot more competitive and a lot more consistent. But for McLaren, I mean, they clawed back oh God, I want to say almost a second, maybe just over a second worth of performance. And they've done that in 6-7 races within the season. I mean, obviously this is something that they were working on before the season got underway. But that being said, it's such a massive shift because of these regulations, because of the ATR testing, because of the cost cap, that they were able to kind of do this and gain that amount of performance back. I think that if you like you had said, like a team like Mercedes or Ferrari, I think a team like that, or maybe Aston Martin, if they hit on something right away, I think they can claw back quite a bit of that performance to Red Bull. I mean, if you look at it, it is mostly race pace. I mean, it's not necessarily quali pace, because we've already seen them be out-qualified by Ferrari and by Mercedes. One at the Italian Grand Prix and the other at Hungarian Grand Prix. But that being said, I just think that if the teams, Mercedes and Ferrari in particular, who aren't, hampered by, old technology within their factory, they have great employees, they have state-of-the-art everything, and they have backups of state-of-the-art everything. I can't see why they can't make a shift like that for next season. I think for me, that's just going to be the most fascinating thing when we get to testing in Bahrain next year. But yeah.
The only thing I'd say there is that it would be the requirement that Red Bull doesn't make that. And it's not so much that I don't think the other teams can make a big gain, but for Red Bull not to do it when clearly they've put a lot of their energy and focus into next year because of the limitations they had this year, which perhaps maybe reflects slightly badly on this year's development, what they could have achieved had they had a normal amount of ATR testing.
Sure, because now they only have 60%. They still only have 60% of ATR testing until they get to, I believe it's the end of October.
Yeah. That's where I'm a little bit skeptical. But interesting as well, you mentioned McLaren. They've got a big update coming to Lando's car this weekend, and they're talking about that in similar kind of terms as what they brought to the car in Austria, which was the original breakthrough, only it's more focused on low-speed corners, which we know has been a weakness for them. So it will be really interesting to see if they can make another step. I'm not expecting lap time to be of the same magnitude, but the thing is, slow-speed corners, you can actually make up a huge amount of lap time because you'll spend so much time there by the very nature of them being slower that often it is a key to unlocking it. So, look, I mean, if McLaren make another step of a similar size and kind of almost move into a clear second behind Red Bull, then I think, then we can start to think, oh, wait a minute, there's so much potential in these cars that's yet to be unlocked. And maybe even Red Bull can't outrun that.
I mean, remember when we were at the British Grand Prix and all of a sudden McLaren was battling up at the front with Max Verstappen and Red Bull. I think a lot of us were like, well, where the hell did all that come from? Right? It was wild, man. That was that's a great event too for folks watching and listening. You definitely want to go and check out the British Grand Prix. It was a ton of fun. I had a blast. Let's talk about 80-year-old Helmut Marko. Had made a derogatory comment towards Red Bull Racing driver Sergio Perez a few weeks ago. Last week, Marko issued an apology. Now, it's not the first time that Marko has made a discriminatory comment towards Perez. This past time, though, he's blaming Sergio's poor performances and inconsistencies to that. He is, quote, South American. You wrote about this on ESPN.com on Thursday. So Sergio was asked about Marko's comments today being Thursday. And obviously you're in Singapore and you'd written about this. Can you just give us a little more context as to what happened with all that?
Yeah, so Sergio kind of said, that he understood where Helmut Marko was coming from, in that he didn't take it personally. He didn't take offense to it because he said his own personal relationship with Marko, a phrase he used a number of times in the press session, meant that he kind of, didn't take it too personally, basically. But he did say he could see why it is, and I think we can all agree, offensive. And so it seemed a little bit like Perez was ready to, just brush it under the carpet and be done with it. But yeah, you do wonder, it just seems so out of place now it's always been out of place, comments like that. But now, yeah, it really does seem out of step with what the rest of the sport is trying to do to make sure that everyone from every type of background has a chance to perform, and people are judged on what they can do. And Formula One has the potential to really be a leading light in that. If you're a top engineer, okay, now to get into engineering, of course, you do need certain things in your life. You need certain backgrounds to probably be able to make a go at that. But the idea being that no matter where you're from in the world, what your skin color is, what your religion is, what your race is, if you're good enough in Formula One, there will be a place for you, because performance is what matters above all else. And for Helmut Marko to even suggest that performance is related to ethnicity, and then of course to get it wrong, saying he's South American when he's from Mexico, it's you just don't want to say anymore. And you're right, it's not the first time Marko's said something like that, but as far as I'm aware, it's probably the first apology we've seen. Now, I'm not sure, I don't think just being able to apologize for things makes that okay. But I think there is now a recognition at Red Bull, and hopefully within Helmut Marko's mind as well, that you can't say stuff like this. It's not right, and it is offensive. I
think we need to get Helmut some geography lessons as well, because Sergio, obviously being from Guadalajara and Mexico, North America, unbelievable, man. Zhou Guanyu signed on with Alfa Romeo. That news came out earlier on Thursday. So next year's Alfa Romeo lineup is confirmed. They'll also be leaving. So Alfa Romeo, obviously, for those watching and listening, they're also going to be leaving the team. And I'm assuming that is going to go back to being Sauber. And now Zhou Guanyu will be back with the team with Valtteri Bottas. He did say for this season that he had targets that he had to hit for him to stick around at the team. And one of those targets was matching his teammate Valtteri Bottas. And, he's done that. I think at some points he's been a lot better than Valtteri. I think some points he's been right on the same mark as him. Some points he's been just a little bit behind. But I mean, I like Zhou Guanyu coming back to this team. He, in my opinion, has been fantastic this season. Considering the car, I mean, the car hasn't been. His car is not good. It's not.
That's
good.
Right. Yeah. I think he's measured up well against Valtteri, and I think there wasn't an obvious reason to get rid of him. The only possibility was Theo Porcher. Of course, looks like he's on his way to the F2 title. Is one of their young drivers. Will continue as their reserve driver next year. And I guess the only question was, is it worth taking a punt on him? But of course, as you alluded to, this team, Sauber, as we should really probably start to call them, I know they're still officially Alfa Romeo this year, but Sauber, has a very interesting few years ahead of it. So you've got 24 and 25, where, I expect it will be the stake Sauber F1 team if the current sponsorship deal they have there remains in place. And then it changes to Audi in 2026. And so a lot of everything that's going on there, well, basically everything that is going on there at the moment is aimed towards that 2026 date, because Audi are expecting to come into Formula One and be able to be competitive. Of course, they're building their own power units, very big deal, and they're investing in Hinwil, the home of Sauber, to try and make sure they've got a chassis to match it. And at some point, they're also going to have to think about which drivers they want in place for 2026. Now, given the current driver market, where why we haven't really had much conversation about drivers moving teams is because most of them were already under contract for 2024. And a lot of those contracts end in 2024. There's some which obviously go longer. Norris is end of 25, Max is 2028, but I don't think he's actually in the Audi conversation at all, funny enough. But yeah, lots of drivers ending at 2024. So it makes a lot of sense, just for the stability of the team at the moment. Whether bringing in Pourchaire would have worked as a rookie, there's a lot of risks involved with that. And yeah, Zhou has done nothing which makes you think, a rookie could come in and do a better job. It would feel maybe like they're taking a step back when really what they need to do is have an element of consistency there, so they can work on their understanding of these ground effect regulations, which while they are going to change quite significantly going into 26. There's still going to be an emphasis on that, and with a whole new technical team there as well, I think it's quite wise to keep as many things in place as you can, so that you're not dealing with many different types of variables. So I agree. I think it was the right decision, and let's see what he can do. I'm not sure whether I don't really think he is a long-term prospect for them into the Audi era, but if he proves me wrong over the next 2 years, I'll happily see him stay in that seat. Yeah,
it's that seat is going to be highly coveted over the next few years, like just because there's been so many rumors about, who could possibly go to Audi. Could Valtteri stay on and help them usher in Audi into the 2026 championship? I mean, he could possibly. Again, you'd have to keep up his performances, but there's other drivers who are going to be on the market, like you'd, have pointed out, like Lando Norris. I mean, what's stopping Audi throwing a ton of money at Lando and bringing him over, right? Like nothing. So I think the next few seasons are going to be extremely interesting down at that team in terms of the driver market for sure. But for here and the now, that leaves just Williams and AlphaTauri with seats available. Obviously, Logan Sargent hasn't been confirmed at all for Williams for next season, and then same goes AlphaTauri seat with currently Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson. I kind of see Logan sticking around at Williams. I could be wrong, but I can kind of see that playing out. It is. I think he does deserve another season, considering fresh out of F2 and just dumping him into an F1 ride and a tricky car at that to begin the season was probably not an easy thing for him. But looking at the two AlphaTauri seats, what do you think happens with those two seats? Do you think Yuki Tsunoda turns into a reserve driver down at Red Bull, and then they throw Daniel Ricciardo and Liam Lawson in full time at AlphaTauri, or do you think they keep Yuki on full time and bring Daniel in, and then take Lawson down as the reserve driver? Because that's an interesting dynamic that's there. You have three really talented drivers. I don't know how you manage that.
Yeah, it's a really tough equation to try and solve, isn't it? I think it'd be a real shame if Yuki isn't driving that car next year, because I think of those three drivers, he's the one who has been the other two have had a very short go at it, but Yuki really has stepped up, addressed a lot of the weaknesses he's had in previous years, and now looks like a very complete driver. But I can see arguments for Lawson, considering how impressive he's looked in his short run so far. Looks like he's going to get another 2 races. So 4 races starts to become a sample where you can, take out some of the randomness of F1 races. I mean, the first race wasn't really fair to judge him on that, because he had one practice session into a wet qualifying into a wet race. But even there, he didn't make a huge error. It was still relatively impressive. So, it's a really tough one to figure out. I mean, I do wonder whether the Logan Sargent element, could come into it as well, because there's no reason if Williams were absolutely committed to Sargent not to have done a deal by now, as far as I'm concerned. He's been a part of that team for a while. There's lots of very good reasons to keep him from that side of it, but the performance hasn't been there, because you've got to remember Williams at the moment are 7th in the Constructors' Championship, ahead of 10 points ahead of Haas, ahead of Alfa Romeo, and ahead of AlphaTauri. And all of those points, I think it's 21 points, all of those points have been scored by Alex Albon. Yeah. So that car has been, I mean, look, I'm not underplaying what Alex has done, because I think he's had an absolutely fantastic season, put himself up there, in conversations alongside some of the very best in the sport at the moment. But Logan has definitely underperformed. And I wonder whether a solution of some sort would be some kind of loan deal for whether it's Lawson, Yuki. I don't know whether it would be quite the right fit, but yeah, Lawson maybe would work that way. But I've kind of given up trying to second guess the Red Bull driver program, because sometimes it works in very mysterious ways that some of us struggle to get our head around, like Nick de Vries coming in, doing half a season, then getting booted out.
Did you see, switching conversations, I mean, did you see on the Haas social media account this morning, there's a meme of Gunther Steiner. He's talking to Pedro De La Rosa in the paddock.
I haven't seen this. No, yeah, you have to.
Dude, you gotta go take a look. You gotta go look at this.
Okay.
And literally, the image is like Pedro De La Rosa is talking to Gunther, and Gunther's like looking up to the sky with his hand. It looks like he's trying to like hold up a ceiling while he's talking to Pedro De La Rosa, and then Haas is like basically asking fans to comment on what he's actually saying there. It's
nice.
Wild, man. It is unbelievable. Some of the things that guy does, he's absolutely incredible. Haas in itself, I mean, it hasn't been the greatest of seasons. It's been nice for Nico Hülkenberg in terms of qualifying. As for Kevin Magnussen, it's been a bit of a disaster as well. But in race conditions, it's been horrible for both. So they're set to ditch this current car concept that they've had for this season. Apparently, by the U.S. Grand Prix, it's going to look a lot different. They're going to move closer towards the downwash concept that Red Bull has going for it, or is almost perfected. The decision was made before the summer break, though, Laurence. I mean, the team knew they had hit a ceiling with this performance in this car and this concept, and so they had to make the switch. But I mean, they haven't spent much of their own budget. You know what I mean? Because like, if you're not going to develop the current car that you have, then technically you have the money that's left over to develop this into a bigger package. And what's surprising is Haas bringing this forward to the U.S. Grand Prix in terms of the season almost coming to a conclusion. And for me, it's oddly strange why they couldn't pull that off a little bit sooner.
Yeah, I think it kind of speaks to the peculiarities of the Haas business model, which is outsourcing pretty much all of certainly all of the construction of the chassis to Dallara. And so it's probably in a time when you really need efficiency in every sense, aerodynamically, obviously, but in terms of your efficiency of getting an idea from the design office, they have theirs based in Maranello now, onto the car, and having as few kind of roadblocks as possible through that process. That's very much the reason Aston Martin have moved into this beautiful new factory in Silverstone. It's a lot of it is just based around efficiencies, because it's so important under both the ATR we talked about earlier and the cost cap. And so it seems that Haas's model, we've seen this in previous seasons as well, seems to work better where they focus a lot on a big upgrade and it comes to the car. But there's no point in adding. Gunther has said this so many times to the media. There's no point in just adding stuff to the car because you feel you need an upgrade. It of course has to bring performance, and they will not add or construct any of these parts until they know that it brings performance. So clearly, there's something in that whole process that is slightly delayed, and also of course the underpinnings of that car are very much Ferrari. They take as many bits off the shelf as they are allowed under the regulations from Ferrari to construct that car. And so while they still do a lot of their own work, I think there are limitations there, suspension kind of geometries, pickup points, gearbox, all that kind of stuff. That's all based on what Ferrari want to make work that year. And then Haas is kind of retrofitting around that. And I think there's been occasions, start of 2022, when Ferrari arguably had the fastest car on the grid, where that's a great situation to have, because Haas, as well, having a huge amount of ATR availability built up, having finished last, and also focusing so much of their budget in 2021 into 2022, nailed it and came out of the starting blocks very, very fast. But yeah, I think we've seen the limitations again of what is a very different business, or maybe business model is not the right word, but very different model of constructing a racing car to some of the others. And I think it does have limitations. Having said that, there's some smart people there, and if they can get it right for Austin, that's good. And yes, it is strange to see a team bring an update, such a big update, so late in the season. But if it opens up an avenue of performance development that you want to pursue, kind of getting that and knowing that it's the right one by the end of this year will make them much happier and probably in a much better position to extract performance from a car next year, which presumably will use exactly the same philosophy. So I get it, but I do think it speaks a little bit to the limitations Haas just face because of the way they're set up.
And then they also have like their MoneyGram sponsorship too, with all of this as well, that was announced back at the US Grand Prix October last year. So they have the budget, which is what I find interesting, and so they haven't spent all of that budget, and so I have to wonder I guess what all can they do with what's left over in terms of budget? Because I've never asked one of the teams that question. Like, if you have budget left over, like what the hell do you do with it? Because you can't spend it on the car anymore. So does that go into marketing? Does that go, into your social...
Catering's the obvious answer, isn't it? Don't take the Red Bull route and just mark it under the right part of the cost cap. That's a good question. I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like, look, they would have known the situation for several months now, and I feel like it'll be portioned in the right place. But yeah, I just think it's just a limitation of that team that's holding them back. And of course, when I talk about efficiency, we can talk about efficiency in time, but also efficiency in money. And I can't believe that their model, where they're essentially paying Dallara to build so many of the parts, is going to be more efficient than teams that have got their own autoclave and are doing it in house. Yeah. So it's probably a more expensive process as well, I would have thought. Yeah. I don't know for certain, but
yeah, that's a good point, because they do have a lot of their stuff getting made from Dallara as well, and they don't really have anything in terms of a giant factory that they can just go and throw parts together in, and wind tunnels and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I get that. That's actually an interesting thing, and it's interesting to see if Haas would be willing to move away from that model eventually, later on down the line, eventually build like a full-fledged factory just for themselves, so they could speed up this process for themselves. It's fascinating. It'd be an interesting story. It'd be interesting to talk to Gunther about that too. New teams process. So Andretti Global rebranded itself last week. So left Andretti Autosports and is now Andretti Global. So the FIA, and this kind of where this is all going to fit in here. So the FIA, way back in the wintertime, announcing, that they would approve teams, like an approval process for teams to enter into Formula One. Obviously, F1 wasn't too happy about the FIA launching that process, but at the same time, the FIA does have to do that at the same time. I think it would, for this whole situation to go down, I mean, the FIA would have to approve Andretti Global and another team. So for the Concorde agreement, it only allows the Concorde agreement currently, it only allows for, I believe it's 12 teams, so 24 cars on the grid. And if you're bringing in 2 new teams, that's 2 new teams, that's 12 teams, that's 24 cars. But Andretti Global has been pushing to try and get a team into Formula One, but there's been a lot of pushback from F1 teams. And I remember, Toto Wolff had spoken pretty strongly about it during the British Grand Prix, one of the press conferences that I was in for that. And essentially, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that they want it to be that whoever the team is that's coming in is bringing value. But I think at the same time, it also has to be the franchising nature of all of this, right? Like the F1 teams have exploded in terms of their value. And so, does having this extra team coming in, water down that value?
Well, that's the big question that we're looking at. I mean, I think kind of almost undoubtedly it does. You know, by the very nature of it, if you're one of 10 and you become one of 12, it, you know, you're less special than you were previously. And I think that is ultimately the biggest reason the other teams have kicked up such fuss. What we have to remember is that the other teams don't really, apart from putting pressure, don't really have any say in this process. The process at the moment is the FIA's one, which they haven't yet announced what they're going to do, but it is looking increasingly like they're certainly very keen, from what Mohammed Ben Sulayem said, the FIA president, to have potentially 2 new ones. They could just do one, but it looks like 2 candidates go forward. But then those candidates have to strike a deal with Formula One, a commercial deal, to fall under what is traditionally known as a Concorde agreement, and essentially to make it worth their while as well, because we've had situations before where we've had more than 10 teams, and under the Bernie Ecclestone system, there was a time when certain teams weren't eligible for prize money because they had to finish in the top 10 for, I think, 2 consecutive seasons to be able to do that. And therefore, there were a bunch, we're talking about the Caterham, Marussia / Manor, HRT days where, where they weren't. And you ended up in this very messy situation. So that's what F1 really must avoid. And I don't think would be healthy at all for the sport. And the other argument, the one which I have a bit more sympathy for, is that we've only just got to a stage really where we've got 10 healthy teams in F1. A lot of that is off the back of the recent boom in popularity in F1. But just how fragile is that? You can draw a graph and you say, well, it's going to continue in this way, and therefore there'll be X amount more money in 5 years. So of course we can sustain 2 more teams. Or you can look at it and say, well, what if it flatlines or even drops? Haas is a very good example that we're just talking about, and the MoneyGram deal, which you referenced. If there aren't enough, if there isn't enough interest in the sport for big name companies with deep pockets to come in and stick their branding on cars, it all of a sudden does become quite difficult, even under the budget cap, to make these teams profitable. So we found this situation now where you can quite easily have 10 teams, all of which now are really quite competitive. Okay, we've got a situation right now where Red Bull's leading, but adding 2 more teams, I don't believe is going to solve that problem, which is probably F1's biggest problem right now. But you've got 9 teams behind that. They're very closely matched, to the point that, you wouldn't rule any one of them out from scoring points. And then you've got, the Aston Martin, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes battle, where you wouldn't rule any one of them out from getting a podium pretty much every weekend you turn up. So, that's perhaps, depending on who you talk to, quite a delicate ecosystem. Some people would say not so much, and of course you can add 2 more, and there's plenty going around. But it all depends on how you look at the sport. I'm quite glad it's not my decision, because I'm not entirely sure where I fall on that, but I can see both sides of the argument.
Like, one of the things is for all this process, like I think the FIA obviously has to make sure that all their boxes are checked in terms of Andretti Global or whoever that they deem are going to be relevant enough to bring some value into the sport. But like, I think I take a look at all this, and and I remember it was I want to say it was Miami Grand Prix 2022, and this conversation had come up where it's like, okay, well, the teams were like, okay, well, we got to make sure that whoever's coming in here is bringing value to the sport. What are they bringing in, et cetera, et cetera. But then my argument back to that would be like, there's probably only a few teams on the grid who actually really bring in value into Formula One, right? Like, we could probably name 4 of them right now. And, once no offense to Haas or anything like that, but they haven't been in the sport for long enough. They haven't had the successes in the marketing capabilities that the likes of Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, now Aston Martin. So it's kind of, I don't view that as like a legit argument. You know what I mean, Laurence? Like, it doesn't.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this comes down to how big you think the grid needs to be, because I would say if we lost a team, like, an 18-car grid, we've seen them before Even if it's just cars not starting the race, and they do start to look a bit sparse. So the value of having 10 teams is, seems quite high. But then, would 12 add more? Would it add a significant amount more? This seems to be what F1 isn't so sure about. Domenicali hasn't really gone out and said it, but he's kind of hinted at it at times. And then there's this bigger debate, and I think this is really what it's coming down to, and it's always down to money. It is how much they're paying in this dilution fee, which is currently set at $200 million.
That's going to change.
That's
got to change.
And it's got to change, but it's got to change. But then if these teams now, the ones that the FIA are assessing and are going through all their documents and accounts and everything, and can they go and do this? They've based it on 200. Like, what else could they base it on? If a number gets plucked out the air and handed to them, and it's 800 million, like where are they going to find that from? So it's a bit of a messy situation. I think this speaks to the wider politics at play here, where I think this is falling into a bit of a power struggle between the FIA and FOM that predates all of this. That we know that's existed. It's almost existed as long as the sport. There's been through different dynamics, of course. Max Mosley, Bernie Ecclestone, at times, they work together very much. But it does seem since Mohammed Ben Sulayem's come in, there's been a desire to prove that the FIA is a necessary force in the sport and has a certain amount of power in the sport. And at the same time, there seems to be a kind of push from F1 that, perhaps, some of the FIA stuff gets in the way of them going out and making their money, which is their job. And so quite naturally, I think when you've got a dynamic like that, there is a bit of a power struggle. But my hope is that we don't get in such a messy situation over these two potential new teams that kind of flares up and actually damages the sport. In the meantime, it's kind of interesting to follow. I think having two new teams on the grid, if they're good and they can be competitive, and that's not easily done. We just talked about how difficult it is for Haas, and so again, I feel like I would need to know more about the exact details of any team's business model coming in to decide whether they really would add that value. That will be key. So an Andretti team that can come in and, okay, maybe not straight away. It's going to inevitably take a bit of, kind of getting used to it, a couple of years or so. But after 2 years, you'd kind of want them fighting in the midfield, wouldn't you? Otherwise, or certainly within that kind of big midfield group that's moving around at the moment. So, yeah, it's an interesting one. But again, another one as a journalist. Hey, this is great. Yeah, political power struggles. Yeah, absolutely. Give me more.
Give me more for the cost cap. So last week, the FIA releasing the cost cap. Obviously, that all the teams had received were receiving the certificates, so they'd all complied. It's not something that's been talked about too much, Laurence, but this is a big deal for this to have happened, because obviously with Red Bull breaking the cost cap and receiving the penalty that they've received, they had to get this right. They had to make sure that everybody was going to be on the same page, and there wasn't for this cost cap to actually work, right? Like, this is a big moment, I think, for Formula One, in particular, this rule and regulation.
It is. I remember this very race in Singapore last year was when we first heard, oh, wait a minute, two teams have not complied with the financial regulations.
Everybody's like, who is it? Oh,
and by how much? And there were some wild figures going around. The sort that could have seen a team had they done it. The kind of above 5% level kicked out of the championship and stuff like that as one of the potential penalties. Of course, that wasn't the case. It was much more than that. But yeah, had it been broken again, it would have been really tough, because the FIA then would have had to come up with a penalty that would act as a real deterrent. Because all of a sudden you've got a situation where clearly teams are still willing to push the boundaries and take liberties. And if you've got that, it no longer becomes a fair sport. If you've got teams that will always try and push it. So I think it's very important and very positive. This is one story I'm actually glad I'm not writing and digging into. It's very positive that they've all made it, because it does. Yeah, it's essential for the integrity of the sport going forward. For the cost cap, I think the cost cap is a brilliant and very necessary thing in Formula One that I know it sometimes looks like it's stopping other teams catch up with Red Bull and so on. But I think over time will be a very important thing. And I think is also one of the key reasons why we have seen the likes of Aston Martin and McLaren make such big gains relative to other teams this year. You know, I think it needs to be there. And also for the health of these new teams, if they do come in. I was talking earlier about, you know, whether the interest in F1 wanes a little over the next few years. Well, if it does, at least the budget cap kind of helps the teams protect themselves against themselves for to some extent. And I think, it's essential that they all complied this, last year, but it was announced this year.
Yeah, it's all full circle, eh? Like, it's just so important that I think this cost cap gets put in place. Like you had said perfectly, you know, saves themselves from themselves. Is, you know, you can't put it any better than that, to be honest with you. It's pretty spot on. I've always been a fan of it ever since it was introduced, because I think you know, eventually it allows these teams to even have more value. You know, we were talking earlier about, you know, these franchise now being designated as franchises like they do with North American sports and here in Canada as well. It just makes more sense. It offers more value to to what you own, what you have, and that in terms gives Formula One more value, which in then terms grows the sport more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's been a smart thing. Getting a new Concorde agreement, I know that's something that's been of discussion lately. Believe this one ends at the end of 2025, if I'm not mistaken. But Liberty Media seems that they're going to be able to get this thing done. I don't know if you've been following any of that story or not, but do you remember Chase Carey, though, trying to get these guys to agree on a Concorde agreement? Do you remember that? Oh, my God.
Wow. Yeah. And the years of Bernie doing it and cutting Ferrari a deal and just watching the rest of them fall into line. Yeah. And you remember FOTA, the Formula One Teams Association, and the breakaway in 2009 that they threatened. So, you know, it's we certainly had messier situations than right now. And I think it's because of the place that the sport is in off the back of its recent boom in popularity, that hopefully everyone will see sense and go along. But of course, everyone's always looking for a little bit more of the pie if they can get it. So I think it's the very nature of these negotiations that they probably will end up running up until a deadline, and sometimes beyond a deadline to the next deadline, extended deadlines, because you know, everybody wants to get the very best, and it's only when everyone's a little bit unhappy that you know that the perfect deal has been brokered. And under Bernie's rule, I seem to remember lots of people being very unhappy and him usually being quite happy, which told you all you need to know about it.
Laurence, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Really appreciate it. Let everybody know where they can find you and what you've got going on.
Yeah, so ESPN.com is where you'll find most of my work, /F1. And what we've got going on? Well, of course, coverage of the next two races. I'll be in Japan as well, which is always one of my favorites. And I had a sit-down interview with Valtteri Bottas today where we talked about all sorts of stuff that he's doing outside of F1. So that will be coming in the next couple of weeks.
Please tell me you talked to him about his cycling pedigree, because
a little bit. So it's mainly like business deals and investments, but we did talk about his cycling, and and you know, he's pretty good. He's really very good. And also,
sorry,
no, I was going to say, I sat down for the interview, and he was wearing a kind of polo shirt and some quite short shorts, and he's got real cyclist tan lines going now, like a real straight line from wearing the I don't know, whatever it's the lycra, I guess, that they wear. So no, he takes it very seriously, and he is pretty good. He's winning competitions in Duffman costumes. You know, it's impressive.
He beats Alistair Brownlee,
exactly,
in a cycling array. Like that's nuts to me. Like, that's crazy, because I actually followed. Well, I didn't follow the race, but when the race was over, I actually went back and went through the finishing order to see where all the big time cyclists and triathletes ended up. And I was like, Valtteri Bottas. I'm like, what the hell is he doing there? And then I'm like, Alistair Brownlee. I was like, he beat Alistair. So I ran into him at the Canadian Grand Prix. I was talking to him in the tunnel that goes up to the media media room there at the track, and I was talking to him about it. And I'm like, you beat Alistair Brownlee, dude. And he's like, I didn't even know I passed him. He's like, apparently I passed him. Like, Valtteri, like, didn't even know. Like, he was telling me the whole story, how it went down.
Yeah.
This is dying laughing, man. He's a good dude though. Hey, like he's fun to talk to.
Yeah. He's a really nice, solid guy. And I think at the moment we're seeing the real Valtteri, that I don't think we always saw at Mercedes due to the pressures that go with being at a top team up against Lewis Hamilton. So no, I think he's in a really good part of his life, and it's lovely to see. And I hope that he, and one thing he made very clear in the interview, even though we didn't really talk about F1, was that he intends to stay for many years to come. Nice. So we'll have to see whether he becomes part of that Audi deal going forward.
Nice. Thanks again, Laurence, for taking the time to do this. Really appreciate it, man.